Hey guys, Eads right here, and today I'm going to be doing the next installment in my great classic album series. First off, I was a little annoyed because I literally filmed the entire thing, and then my iPad, which for those who don't know is what I film on, decided it was going to restart out of the blue, and it didn't save anything. So here I am the next night trying to do it again. If you're watching this, then clearly I made it. And second thing before I get into this, because I feel like some people might ask and might be confused, I am going to talk about 3 different albums that came out in 2018, which to many people is far from being a classic year, and I totally understand you. However, as you can tell, I am younger, and the 3 albums I'm talking about are either albums that have grown on me a ton since 2018, or have played a crucial role in my musical development of my music taste in general. And to be quite frank with you, for any older watchers of my channel, because I know I could see the age of who's watching. I know that I do have a handful of older viewers as well. I feel like I do like covering newer albums because I feel like some of the older listeners or watchers might not have heard them, and I feel like they should. That being said, I just want to kind of get straight into this. The first album I'm going to be talking about in this episode of Great Classic Albums is from 1969, and it is from none other than the legend himself, the king himself, Elvis Presley, from Elvis in Memphis. This is really Elvis's one. This is one of the few Elvis albums that I actually think leave a profound impact. I love Elvis. I love his voice. I love his music. But Elvis is not an album's artist. Simply because when he started and got big in the 50s, the album format really wasn't perfected yet. In many ways, it was just a collection of singles. And even though he did have a few occasional big, really solid, great albums, such as his debut album, you know, he's never really been known for his albums. But if there is one Elvis studio album that I think really does reign supreme above all the others, it is From Elvis in Memphis from 1969. It is Elvis's first album recorded at American Sound Studios with the new Memphis Boys backing band. And a lot of this really was the reason why this album really came to be in many ways, and the reason why there was such a change up, was because Elvis kind of had a resurgence during 1969 and that late 60s, early 70s era. A lot of it had to do with the extremely successful 1968 Comeback Special, which is arguably his greatest concert. And because of that newfound success, I honestly feel like Elvis was also just at a creative high. And with him working at a new studio, which was known for a more soulful sound, as well as a new backing band, the album has a very soulful and even a bit of a country soul sound to it, which is a very refreshing change for Elvis, considering in the 60s, much of the albums he was putting out were soundtrack albums to the endless amount of movies that his abusive manager, Colonel Tom Parker, forced him to do. And I think that this album contains some of his greatest songs, such as In the Ghetto, which is one of the best Elvis songs, period. And also the songs Suspicious Minds and Kentucky Rain didn't end up on the main edition of the album, but they were also recorded during this era, during these sessions. So overall, Elvis was at a creative high here, and From Elvis in Memphis is an excellent Elvis album that I think definitely deserves a spot on this list. The second album I'm going to be talking about in this video is from The Who, Quadrophenia from 1973. This is my personal favorite Who album, and I honestly think from an objective standpoint, you can make the case that this just is the best Who album. It takes the very rock opera and very anthemic elements of Tommy from 1969, but with the much more harder, rougher, and grittier edge of their more standard rock album, Who's Next, and it comes together to make one of the most cohesive sounding albums I've ever heard, with not only a great concept and story behind it, it sees the band revisit their mod roots with a mod main character, and the movie is really good as well. I really like the Quadrophenia movie. But just musically as well, everybody is on top of their game here, between Keith Moon pounding the skin so hard here. Or, you know, you have John Entwistle's To Die For bass playing, like on The Real Me, one of the best bass lines of all time. Or you have just Pete Townshend, well, his guitar playing is not that flashy. He's one of the best writers of the classic rock era. And then, you know, Roger Daltrey, is it even worth saying how great his vocals are on this album? Through and through, Quadrophenia is a solid project from front to finish. I come back to it more than any other Who album, and I wanted to show you guys this. See this thing that I got here? Yeah, that's from the album cover. I really love this album. I think this is one of the best albums of all time. The Who's Quadrophenia from 1973. The third album I'm going to be talking about jumps ahead a decade. I'm going to be talking about the Psychedelic Furs' Forever Now. I think that Forever Now is one of the greatest new wave albums, period. Well, obviously I love bands like Depeche Mode and The Smiths and The Cure, Echo and the Bunnymen. There is something very unique about the sound of the Psychedelic Furs. Something that really made them stand out, and it's really hard to pinpoint what it is. I don't know if it's the production, I'm not quite sure exactly, but there really just is something, and none of their albums prove that better than Forever Now. Not only does this album have their huge hit Love My Way, which I think is not only just their biggest hit, one of their best songs, and one of the best songs of the entire 80s, it has a bit of a punk flair to it on many songs, such as the opening track. But it's very beautifully composed. It's not too dirty sounding. It's very well crafted, very well polished as well, with some excellent instrumentation. There's even a goth flair on some of the songs, especially in the more scratchy, deep vocals. I even thought there was a bit of a ska influence on the track Goodbye, which kind of sounds like a Pop Dead Kennedys in a way. Either way, the Psychedelic Furs really did make a really well-crafted album that, to me, is their best album and one of the most innovative albums coming out of that new wave era in the 80s. I really like Forever Now from 1982, and I think everybody should check out that album. Now we are jumping ahead another decade here with an album from 1990. And a bit of a disclaimer, I try to refrain from talking about bands that I talk about quite heavily on this channel. I've already covered the new Network albums, I've covered the new Green Day albums, but the album I'm going to be covering here from 1990 is Green Day's 39 Smooth, their debut album. It's far from being the most well-polished album in their career, and, even though I try to refrain from talking about them because I talk about them so much, I love this album. I think this might be my personal favorite Green Day album out there. It's just a debut album to die for. It's one of the most well-crafted punk albums, in my opinion, and I think that it's just young punks messing around with some of the most heartfelt and passionate teenage lyrics. It just comes across so energetic, so youthful, so much fun and energy. There's a lot of good energy and positive vibes here. And I come back to this album more than I come back to many of their other albums. It has this very good East Bay punk sound, one of the best albums out of the East Bay punk scene in the 90s. And there are just many great songs on here, between the very nostalgic I Was There to the very kind of stonery Rest, which is arguably my favorite Green Day song. I just love how different that song is and how it's in a 3/4 time signature. Overall, I just think 39 Smooth is one of Green Day's most passionate albums, and a lot of it has to do with the fact that they were just simply young teenage punks that were recording an album, and it came across really good, and to this day I love this album, so I felt like it was worth talking about. Green Day's 39 Smooth from 1990. And the next album I'm going to be talking about kind of goes off what I said. I try not to talk about them too much, but I just couldn't help it. I'm talking about Radiohead's Kid A from 2000. Now, while the Bends may be my personal favorite from them, Kid A might just be, I think, the most beautiful album ever recorded. With some of the most luscious, beautiful soundscapes. I almost said sandscapes. It's just one of the most beautiful albums ever made. Between the really offsetting, eerie synth electronic track that opens it, everything in its right place, to the much more kind of glitchy, a bit more dance, but very kind of offbeat Idiotech, to the very, very emotional, some of their most emotional songs, like How to Disappear Completely and Motion Picture Soundtrack. To me, Kid A is just one of the best albums ever made, period. It's definitely a 10 out of 10 album. And after OK Computer came out in 1997, I feel like many people probably expected them to follow through with another more guitar-centric album. But no, Radiohead decided to do a complete 180 and do a very much more electronic-based album. And the end result was the best possible outcome. I've heard bands try to change up their sound, and sometimes it doesn't go as well. I've also heard bands do it well, so it's not like Radiohead's the only band or the first band who's done this. I mean, Pink Floyd has done it. Even the 1975's new album sort of did it. But the way that they approach it is very uniquely Radiohead. And there's just something about this album that's so infectious, it makes me come back to it time and time again. and the production is flawless, and just overall, Radiohead really hit it out of the park with Kid A. If there's any listeners or people watching that have only heard their 90s material, you have to check out Kid A. It's one of the best albums I think ever made. And we are jumping ahead to the 2010s. I actually have quite a lot to talk about here, because even though I do cover quite a few albums from the 2010s in each video, I feel like as a decade, it often gets written aside just because it is newer, it's a bit fresher in many people's memory, so many people don't consider these albums classic. But considering I'm a younger listener, a lot of these albums to me are classic, and that's why they are on here. And some of these I only recently discovered, such as 2011's album I'm going to be talking about here, James Blake's self-titled album. James Blake really made a very, excellent, atmospheric, experimental R&B album with these beautifully composed electronic soundscapes with just gorgeously produced vocals, with between layered vocals, between the vocoder effect on many of the songs, and just the fact that he's a genuinely good vocalist. This is an album that I wish I came across sooner, because I can definitely hear the influence James Blake has on a lot of music that is popular today, and even a lot of underground music. James Blake's more experimental take on R&B is something that I've heard more and more artists since then tackle, not only as well as James Blake. It's a very experimental album and very risk-taking album, but it's also a very mellow album. It's a very peaceful album, and it's a very relaxing album at the same time. It's a very beautifully put together album. I don't have too much else to say here, other than the fact that the few times I've come back to listen to it, I'm just amazed time and time again of how well it's produced, the gorgeous production, and that's the main thing I can say about it. It's a beautiful album. So yeah, if you haven't checked it out, check out James Blake's self-titled album from 2011. It's really a good album. And I also have another self-titled album. I did not intentionally do that. Royal Blood's self-titled album from 2014. This rock duo, I think, really did hit it out of the park on their debut. I was skeptical at first because, to be fair, they do use a lot of the old rock cliches that we've come to know and get used to, but they execute it in a way that's kind of like a mixture of garage rock with a bit of that Muse in there as well, and a bit of Jack White. It seems like a bunch of blend of a bunch of different things, and I actually think that for an album that does play into a lot of stuff you're used to hearing with rock music, Royal Blood really did add their own spin to it, with a bit of a unique flair, and overall just a relatively solid, straightforward rock album. And once again, it's another album I don't have too much really else to say other than the fact that I think it's a relatively solid album that kind of gets lost in the sea of endless rock releases that come out a lot. And I think that this is one of the best rock albums to come out of the 2010s, at least of this style of rock, the more heavy, gritty style. And so if you haven't checked it out, definitely check out this album. I'd be curious if you want to leave a comment. I'd be curious to see what some people think, if I really like it. But now we are going to get to the 3 albums from 2018 I was talking about. This was also the part of the video where my iPad cut off, and I was a little furious. But the first album from 2018 I'm going to be talking about is from the late Chicago rapper Juice WRLD, Goodbye and Good Riddance. I have really always been a Juice WRLD fan, at least as long as this album's been around, but the more I come back to this album, I have a lot of weird reactions to it. The more I revisit it, the more it grows on me. I think that this album grows on me more and more every time I listen to it, but it also gets harder for me to listen to it now that he has passed on. It may not be as well polished as its successor, Death Race for Love, and it also just might not be as well produced either as that album. It is the exact album I want from emo rap and that style of music, and from Juice WRLD. And even though drug references and themes of depression really do show up time and time and time again on this album, and I understand how that could turn away many listeners, understandably so, I've always felt that it's written from a very heartfelt and passionate place, and I don't feel like he was just doing it to promote the use of drugs, more so to get it off his chest, because it's very clear, and unfortunately we know this now that he's passed away, that he had a pretty big drug problem. And it's saddening to hear an artist that talked about it so often in his music get so little help. Now, obviously, I don't know all the details. I'm not some therapist here. I don't want to go into all of his mental state. But I do think that this is an overarching problem in the modern state of that kind of rap. But either way, even though there was a tragic ending to Juice WRLD's life, this album to me lives on. And I come back to it time and time again, and I feel like its influence has been echoed endless times at this point. You know, I have heard, you know, many artists cite Juice World as an influence, and I think that is crazy to me because back when I first discovered Juice World, it didn't even cross my mind how influential he was going to be. But when I listened to Goodbye and Good Riddance, songs like Lean With Me, Lucid Dreams, you know, All Girls Are the Same, even Wasted with Lil Uzi Vert, I think they're some of the best songs that come out of this wave of more emo and emotional rap. And I think this album grows on me every time I listen to it. It's definitely at least an 8 out of 10 for me now, and I think it's one of the best albums from 2018. Juice WRLD, Goodbye and Good Riddance from 2018. The next album from 2018 I'm going to be talking about is an album that has actually grown on me a lot since 2018. It's an album that I initially liked, but I wasn't that crazy about it. It is 21 Pilots' Trench. And I understand how many people could discredit my opinion here because 21 Pilots gets shit on a lot, mainly due to their younger fan base and stuff, and mainly due to the Blurry Face, which I actually do think is not as great of an album. But Trench, to me, takes all the flaws that I had with Blurry Face, but sort of kind of, you know, improves their sound based around it. Well, it's not, like, the most radical change from Blurry Face. They definitely build upon all the good parts of the album and really do lessen the weaker parts of Blurry Face, and it ends up making a relatively solid album. You know, well, I think most of the flaws are fixed here with better production and better writing. Their sort of rap, pop, alternative rock sound here, I think is the best executed on Trench. The opening track, Jumpsuit, remains to be one of my most favorite 21 Pilots songs, period. And overall, even though I was kind of skeptical when it first came out, I'd be lying if I said it hasn't grown on me a ton. And it has honestly increasingly become one of my favorite albums of 2018. I really look forward to seeing where 21 Pilots goes in the future, because I feel like they're one of those groups that has a lot of potential, but they need to really tap into their potential in order for it to work. They can't just wing it, and I feel like that's what went wrong on some of their previous albums. But what really went right on Trench was that I feel like it's a much more well thought out, well planned out album, and the end result was really good. And the final album I'm going to be talking about, the final album as well from 2018, is from a band that I have talked about on this channel, and I love their new album, but this album's great as well. It's the 1975 A Brief Inquiry into Online Relationships. Even though I do give Notes on a Conditional Form a 10 out of 10, I do think that A Brief Inquiry is right about there as well. They nearly perfected their craft on this album. And it's just an extremely solid sound, ranging from their usual sound that people had already come and gotten used to, as well as very conscious and very heavy-hitting tracks as well. Arguably their most conscious and social album, with songs like Love It, If We Made It, which is one of their best songs, and one of the best songs of the decade, with great social commentary. Overall, it's just a really totally solid album, and they do experiment a lot on here. There's a fair amount of acoustic tracks. There's a fair amount of more traditional pop songs. There's even some. The closing track here seems reminiscent of Pablo Honey and the Benz era Radiohead, but in the best possible way. And to me, the 1975 really proved that they are more than just your boy pop band. And I think that A Brief Inquiry into Online Relationships is an album that I come back to time and time again and like it more and more. And I have a hard time even finding any songs I dislike because I feel like it's such a solidly crafted, well-put-together album. The 1975 really hit it out of the park on A Brief Inquiry into Online Relationships, and if I had to, I could possibly give this album a 10 as well. It's one of my favorite albums of 2018, arguably the best album of 2018, and one of the best 1975 albums. With that being said, that is it for now. That is this video. That is the 10 albums I really like from Elvis Presley, The Who, The Psychedelic Furs, Green Day, Radiohead, James Blake, Royal Blood, Juice WRLD, 21 Pilots, and the 1975. I really enjoy making these videos. If you notice the weird cut in there, I only did that to prevent my thing from crashing miraculously. But that being said, I really love making these videos. If you haven't heard any of these and get around to listening to it, I'd love to hear what you think of these albums down in the comments below. I love when I get feedback. But if not, that's fine. Needless to say, these are all 10 classic albums I love quite a bit. That is it for now, and goodbye.